Amen. Amen. Verse 7, we're thinking tonight about no longer slaves. In verse 7, Paul simply states to the churches at Galatia, "Wherefore thou art no more a servant," or a slave in the Greek, "no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ." This book, the book of Galatians, it was written to churches, not just one church, but different churches that were scattered throughout the region of Galatia. But Martin Luther loved the book of Galatians. He's infamous for loving the book of Romans. Of course, it was the book of Romans that led to his conversion, but he absolutely loved, this was his favorite book of the Bible, the book of Galatians. He called it my epistle, or my letter. And he actually said this about the book of Galatians: "I have betrothed it to myself. It is my wife." I don't know if any of the wives would like being substituted tonight for a book, but that was Martin Luther's perspective concerning the book of Galatians. What he was saying was this, that he loved it so much and he betrothed it to himself that he carried it around really everywhere he went. He loved this book. He would often have used this book whenever he was confronting the papacy, and he was often wielding that dagger that he would use to plunge into the heart of the papacy. If you were to read through this book, you'll find that it's very, very short and very, very snappy, and I think that's why he loved the book so much. It's one of those books that gets straight to the point, really. And after it makes its point, it kind of builds on that point. It really serves as a kind of a rough draft to the letter to the Romans, or the book of Romans. It is just 2,400 words in the Greek, and as I've said, a very short, pithy, snappy book indeed. Paul wrote the book of Galatians to the churches at Galatia with two main aims. The first main aim was this: to define the heart of Christianity. To define the heart of Christianity. Very simply, that we are saved not through our works, the works of the law, but through the work of Jesus Christ. He wrote it then to kind of develop that theme and to define that theme. So he wrote the book of Galatians to define the heart of Christianity, but also then to use this book to defend the heart of Christianity. You see, there were those who were in the region of Galatia, and they were attacking the gospel. Chapter 3, verse 11, you see this here, where Paul very simply states, "No man is justified by the law in the sight of God." You see, those who were raised up, and of course they still exist really in a sense today, and they were called Judaizers. Really, they emphasized the ceremonial law. And what they were saying as they came into the church, as they crept into the church, was that you needed to keep every element of the ceremonial law, every element of it, to be converted, to be saved. You needed to be circumcised, and you needed to adhere to all of those thousands of ritualistic commands that you read of in the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. And so Paul, what does he do? Well, he writes this book, the book of Galatians, to define the heart of Christianity, yes, but then secondly, to use that definition in order to defend the very heart of Christianity. That, of course, that it is the work of Jesus Christ that justifies, and not the works of the law. Now, in chapter 4, in this chapter, he takes up this theme in a little further detail, and he explores not merely the problem, but also the solution. And as he states here, he states in verse 7, "You're no longer slaves." In other words, what he was saying was this, that you're no longer a slave to that ritualistic kind of religion. You're not to be bound to this kind of always hoping, always trying, always seeking to justify yourself through doing, through keeping, through adhering to. That's really what he's developing. And he states, because you're no longer a slave or a servant, then you're a son. Their positions have been changed. They previously were slaves in sin, slaves to this kind of trying to appease God through all that they did. Yes, they were slaves previously, but they're no longer slaves because they're in Jesus Christ, and they're more than slaves, they're sons. They have been adopted into God's family, and they were sons and daughters of God. And tonight, a works-based salvation may appease you. What I mean by that is it may appease your conscience. It may get that kind of thought of, I'm not right with God, there's things wrong in my life. It may appease you. What you do, it may appease you. It may soothe your conscience. But it'll never appease God. That which you offer, the works of your hand, etc. Yes, it may, as it were, seek to soothe your conscience. And that's, of course, why many people try to justify themselves through what they do. It may appease you, but your works will never appease God. They can't, and they won't. And so we want to think tonight about this thought of being no longer slaves as we consider these verses 1 through 7 from Galatians chapter 4. Think with me firstly here about the description they possessed. As Paul writes to them, the description they possessed, verses 1 through 3, really. We read, Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. So these verses, from the outset, they appear difficult, but think about it this way. Paul is speaking to these Galatians before they were converted. Or to put it in another way, before they received their inheritance. Before they received their inheritance. And he uses an analogy here, especially verse 1. He speaks here of a child. The term child here just simply means infant. It really means literally one not speaking. And it speaks of a very, very young child who hasn't even the ability to speak yet. So a very, very young child, a child in infancy. And it speaks here in verse 1 of a child receiving an inheritance, but not receiving that inheritance just yet. Now you think about this in the natural realm. In the vast majority of cases, when a little one is left an inheritance through will or whatever, well, whenever they're just born, the likelihood is they're not going to receive that inheritance. They have to wait to a father, to a grandfather, whoever it is, leaving them that inheritance. They, of course, have to wait until that individual passes away to receive that legacy. So the likelihood is that as they're just born, as they're an infant who is not yet speaking, the likelihood is that they haven't received the inheritance yet. But at the same time, they're in line to receive it. And that's really the thought here in verse 1. That the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant. So the picture here is of a child, and he's going to receive the inheritance in the future, but as of yet he hasn't. Now there was a Roman concept here that Paul's employing. And the Roman concept was this, is that the individual in the household, whether it was a child or whether it was a servant or a slave, unless you were the master of the house, the child was viewed exactly the same as the servant or the slave. He was viewed exactly the same. So yes, one day his inheritance is going to await him. His inheritance, he will receive it one day. But as of yet, he's not the master of the house. So he hasn't received his inheritance, and therefore he is viewed as a servant or has the same standing as a slave. And Paul takes this concept and he applies it to the individuals here in Galatia prior to them becoming Christians. Or to use this terminology, prior to receiving their inheritance. Now, as he's really speaking here of them, and he's really likening them to slaves, he develops this analogy further. Look at verse 3. When we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. Now, the word elements here, it comes from a verb which means to mark in row or rank or file. It has the picture of an army. And they're marching in row. They're marching to the beat of something. They're not really thinking about it. They're just extremely disciplined in doing it. So Paul takes this image to really say that, look, prior to receiving your inheritance, You were a servant, you were a slave, and he really likens their life to that of verse 3. He's saying as they sought to keep the ceremonial law, to try and justify themselves, it would just be as tedious as marching to the beat of a drum, so to speak. You don't really do it, it's very tedious. It kind of bogs these individuals down as they're trying to keep the law. It would bring them into bondage. That's what he says in verse 3. We're in bondage under the elements of the world. So here are individuals and they're slaves. They're slaves to the fact that they're trying to keep every jot and tittle of the ceremonial law, which was impossible. Absolutely impossible. But they're trying to nonetheless. And it's just as if they're just marching. They're just day by day, just living their lives to this drumbeat of trying to appease God through keeping the law. And obeying the law, whilst it is unattainable, can't be done, it's also unbearable. It's absolutely unbearable. When you really think things through and you try and you have this mindset of, I am going to earn my way to eternal life. When you follow that through logically, it's absolutely unbearable. When you think about it, you know yourself because you have sin in your life, but you seek to kind of cover over that sin through doing good or through keeping the law. That is an absolutely unbearable kind of life. Trying to please God through all that you do. And so yes, tonight you can try and keep the law, obey the law, live the law, but you will become frustrated because you can't do it. And I encourage you, if you're not a Christian, to do it this week. To try and keep God's law. Every single jot of it, every single tittle of it. Try and always think good thoughts. Good thoughts in the sense of pure thoughts, of that which is lovely, of that which is just. Never mind the deeds of the hand. And you will find the more you try to please God this way, it'll be like marching to a drumbeat, so to speak. It'll be absolutely unbearable. It becomes monotonous, it becomes burdensome, it becomes repressive. Life becomes extremely strict and extremely regimented. And that's what Martin Luther found. As he gave himself to everything that was required of him in the Roman Catholic faith, what happened to him? He found himself not being able to sleep at night for the thought of just committing one moral sin and then dying and coming before God with sin in his life. And so what did he do? He tried to balance that out by fasting 3 times in the week and depriving himself of sleep. And perhaps this is you tonight. Perhaps this is you. You're seeking to live a very regimented, a very strict life. Perhaps it becomes, you find it just burdensome and unbearable. That's the result of that kind of a lifestyle. And Paul is showing you this, that you're a slave. You're a slave to trying to please God in an improper way. That's why Paul later wrote in chapter 5, verse 1, these tremendous words, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. He's telling them to revel in their freedom. Don't be entangled again by trying to appease God for all that you could do. It's like being in a yoke, as it were. A yoke of bondage. Salvation through this kind of a lifestyle, it is very, very frustrating. You become entangled, you become entrapped, wrapped up in a yoke of bondage. The more you try, you know what you'll find, the more you'll fail. And the more frustrated you'll become. Martin Luther said, indeed, I was a pious monk. If ever a monk could have entered into heaven by monkish merit, then I should have been received therein. Now, I've maybe highlighted before, but you look at pictures of Martin Luther prior to his conversion, he was extremely thin. Extremely thin. But afterwards he was different, because he was content. The description they possessed. Notice secondly with me the redemption they received. The redemption they received. Verses 4 and 5, we read, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. The term redeem here in these verses, there are different words for redeem in the original text, but the particular term here, it's interesting. It means literally, or it speaks literally of someone going to a slave market, entering into a slave market, and paying the price to redeem or to buy that slave out of that slave market. In other words, the individual actually goes to the market, and men know what that's like here. You go to the mart, you enter the mart, etc., and you pay your price for your beast or whatever. Well, here's the thought. The thought is of an individual going to a slave market, going and entering into the market, paying his fair price so that he can secure that slave upon the payment of a price or a ransom. Now remember, this is how Paul has described these individuals. We've already seen this. Slaves. Verse 1, nothing differeth nothing from a servant. Verse 3, children under bondage. So he essentially speaks here of those who are slaves. These individuals who were members of the church of Galatia, prior to their conversion, they were slaves, but something happened. Someone was sent, as it were, into the very slave market of sin to buy or to pay the price for a slave. Who was that person? Who was this individual? Well, these verses tells us, God sent forth his Son to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. You see how Jesus is described here? He was made of a woman, made under the law. In other words, everything that the law required of individuals, he performed and he kept. He was made. That's a legal term. He was legally made of a woman, born of a woman. He literally was a real man. But of course, he was still subject to the law, as every man is. And being subject to that law, he entered, as it were, into this world. He kept the law perfectly. Of course, he then offered up himself as that ransom price for the slave. Those who are still enslaved by their sin. Those who had to, as it were, keep the law to enter into glory, but could not. So here he shows these individuals that this was how they were redeemed. It was through the work of Jesus Christ, entering into the slave market that was this world, and as it were, paying the fair price so that he could purchase them or redeem them. Of course, that price was the offering up of himself unto God as an acceptable sacrifice. And so tonight, what we simply say to you is this, is that if you're looking to your works, you will be frustrated, as I have said, you will be repressed. So look to the one who has done the work for you. Look to the one who was, yes, made, who was made a real man. Yes, he was God, never ceased to be God, but was made as a real man. Took upon himself a real flesh. Why? To redeem you from your slavery. To buy, as it were, you out of that slavery. To set you free from such a lifestyle. You need not be frustrated tonight trying to please God by doing everything that you can and become frustrated because you can't do it. Look to the one who was that acceptable sacrifice for sin. The one who was literally the slave so that you might go free. The one who died for you. Chapter 3 verse 13 puts it this way. Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is every one that hangeth on a tree. And there you have it, the very curse of sin laid on him. Why? To redeem us. He hath redeemed us from the curse of the law. So it's through his death that tonight you can be set free and know liberty. A little boy one day walked into church and he was carrying something very interesting. He was carrying a bird cage, but also two birds within the bird cage. The pastor, of course, wondered about how this is all going to transpire. Said, little boy, well, where did you get the two birds? And he responded, well, I was outside and I trapped them in the field. The pastor said to him, well, what are you going to do with these two birds? And he said, "Oh, when I get home, I'm going to let our old cat at them and play with them." So he got the bird cage and he put it in the back of the church. Little boy forgot about them. Whenever little boy went home, pastor got the two birds and just set them free. Just set them free. And my friend, outside of Jesus Christ, you are, as it were, in a cage of bondage, heading for a terrible end. But Jesus Christ tonight has paid the price to set you free and secure you and release you from such a mindset and lifestyle. The description they possessed, redemption they received. Look lastly with me at the adoption they experienced. Verse 5, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. These Judaizers, they were wreaking havoc in the church. They were teaching that it was absolutely necessary to obey the law fully to possess redemption. And Paul, he reminded this church, didn't he, that it was solely through the ransom price that Jesus Christ offered to God on their behalf. And he really shows them the blessings. From verses 5 through 7, he shows them really the blessings of being redeemed, of being set free. And he states it here in verse 5, to receive the adoption of sons. Now, adoption in Bible times, still like today, it's perhaps less popular, but adoption in Bible times was very, very popular in Greek and Roman culture. And the term here, it was a very, very familiar term in that day. Really has the idea of legally being undertaking to meet all of the need of someone who is placed in your care. Legally, you become their parent, their father, their mother, whatever. You have all of the right, all of the privilege and responsibilities then of being part of that family. So here were individuals, and prior to their conversion, they were slaves, they were servants. Paul says, because you have now been redeemed, because you've been set free, you, as it were, enjoy, you have the privilege, you have the responsibilities as well of being legally members of the family of God. Why? Because I intimated in my opening prayer, and this is why. Because they were bought by blood. They are now part of, as it were, that bloodline. Every individual who is a member of the family of God, they are, as it were, bought by blood. You think in the natural realm, what happens? Well, you're part of a family through a bloodline. And spiritually, that's what happens. You become, as it were, you become part of the bloodline of Jesus Christ. Because we're all bought with the same blood. And so this is really one of the blessings, or one of the many blessings of being redeemed. You enjoy redeemed, but it doesn't stop there. It's not just a simple legal dealing with your sin, where you're legally set free from all of the penalties of your sin. Yes, there is that element to salvation, but it doesn't stop there. You become part of the family of God. Now think about it this way. Prior to your conversion, and if you're not a Christian tonight, I want you to think about it this way. You belong to another family. You belong to the family of Satan. Ephesians 2 makes it very, very clear that you have the spirit of disobedience working in you. In other words, you have the spirit of Satan literally working in you, in a sense. So you belong to him. But my friend, when you enter into Jesus Christ and you're redeemed by Jesus Christ, you receive his spirit. And this very chapter makes this clear. Verse 6, because your sons, God sends forth the spirit of his son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. He owns you, and as he owns you, he then sends forth his spirit into your heart. Tonight, are you part of his family? Are you? This is one of the rights and privileges and joys of being bought by blood. You're no longer a slave. You're brought into his family. It doesn't stop there. You have a new family. But also, of course, you maybe change family. If you're legally adopted, you get a new father, don't you? And verse 6 makes this clear. He sends the spirit of his son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Verse 7, you're no longer a servant, but a son. You receive a new father. Yes, You change family, but what happens in the natural realm when you change family? You get new parents. And spiritually, that's what happens as well. You're no longer a slave to your sin. You're set free, but you receive a new father as well. And my friend, what a joy it is to have one who genuinely loves you and cares for you. I'll make this point. Satan doesn't care for you. He wants to destroy you. He wants to absolutely destroy you. You go through the Bible, you see this. Revelation chapter 12, I believe it is, it speaks of him making war with the saints. He wages war. We hear today about war and individuals who really don't care about individuals. And so what do? They wage war. Satan will wage war against you. That is not the kind of father that I would ever wish to have. But my friend, if you don't belong to Jesus Christ, that's the kind of father that you have. Someone who has absolutely no care for you whatsoever. But when Jesus Christ, when you enter into his family, you get a new father. You cry, Abba, Father. You have a new fortitude as well. God sends forth the Spirit into your hearts. You have strength. What do good parents do? They support their children. They give them strength. They're there for them when things are going difficult, when it's hard. And here God is showing that as he becomes your father, he'll give you his strength. What a joy tonight to be part of the family of God. That wonderful future we enjoy as well. If a son and an heir of God through Christ, they would inherit glory itself. All of these blessings flowing very simply from being redeemed. They're adopted into the family of God. Tonight, Christian, revel in these privileges, revel in these blessings. This blessing of a new father, a new future, a new fortitude or strength. And my friend, if you're not a Christian tonight, what's keeping you back? What's keeping you back from enjoying all of this? All of these blessings that, as Paul states in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, what's laid up for the people of God. So I trust tonight that if you're still perhaps a servant or a slave, you've never trusted in Christ, that it could be said of you as you leave this place in verse 7, thou art no more a servant, but a son. Don't leave here tonight being a slave. Leave here being a son or a daughter of Christ. I know the joy of sins forgiven. May God bless these thoughts to your hearts and lives.